Do you want to know what the fallen are, little one? In a sense, they are angels, but not the angels your mom imagines she prays to. Brass trumpets picnicking in the clouds. In their true essence, they are great swirling engines of wing and blood, fiery eyes that peer around the corners between worlds. Dark, radiant things conjured from fresh battlefields. A Frankenstein's Valkyrie, forever crashing to Midgard. What grief demands their hate, what vast cannibal hunger.
Welcome to the Fallen Cycle Mythos podcast. This is a universe full of secrets, waiting for those brave or foolhardy enough to seek them out. Cycle 1. Tales from When I Had a Face was written and produced by James Curcio, with editing by Brian Johnson. A modern fairy tale about death, loss, and finding redemption in the strangest places for those of us still haunted by the uncertain, occult logic of dreams. The fully illustrated black and white edition of this book is available at Amazon.com. The soundtrack features the work of David Bessel and P. Emerson Williams, along with additional contributions credited in the individual episode notes. Support for this project is pivotal. By becoming a patron at patreon.com/mythosmedia, that's MYTHOS media, you enable us to make more content like this and to be able to hire on more freelance artists in future works. Discover more about the transmedia mythpunk Fallen Cycle universe at fallencycle.com. This podcast contains adult themes and may induce psychosis. And now, this week's episode, Season 2, Episode 5, The Fort at the Edge of Their World.
The path turned into a cobblestone road that wound its way to Highmount. Ahead, electric bulbs swayed and tinkled as they bounced against the metal cables from which they were suspended, a pulse emanating from the furnaces belching beneath our feet. The air left a sour, acid taste in our mouths, and there was an endless mechanical tapping as if an army of telegraphs were churning out messages for recipients unknown. "I have enemies in Chernaya," Eluane said. "Most are old men now, but some may still be dangerous." He searched through his belongings for a moment until he found what he was looking for, the mask he had worn when we ventured to the Amari tent in the bazaar. He slipped it on, and the face of a bearded merchant replaced his own, save for those who knew what to look for. He pulled a tarnished pocket watch from his motley jacket and began rubbing it with the corner of a handkerchief. "It's been a long time since I've had an excuse to wear one of—" "Oh, that's unfortunate," he exclaimed suddenly, frowning. "What?" I asked. He held his pocket watch up to his ear to be sure and then pocketed it again. "It's nothing. It's just dead is all." "I've heard of Highmount, of course, but never actually ventured far south of the capital," Elena said with distaste. "It's so much dirtier here." Eluane agreed mildly. We walked for several more minutes. She didn't speak falsely. The air seemed to leave a film on all it touched, and soon we were all slightly slick with a thin sheen of gray-green oil. "Here." He gestured down a side alley of red-gray bricks lined with girders and pipes, and he peered closely at the wall, running his hands over its surface like a blind man, then staring up at the sky, iron-gray and flat with smoke. He squinted with his new eyes, but his voice sounded the same. "Aita," he said. "What do you see?" I looked at the portion of the wall he indicated. "Nothing. Wait. Markings. Is it a rune of some sort?" He nodded. "A waymark, meaning the messages I've sent here have captured some interest. They are already awaiting our arrival. It indicates a time for our meeting and gives me a hint of where to find the place as well. And to everyone else, it looks like—" "I'm so tired of this. Why are we staring at filthy walls in an alley?" Elena asked, out of breath for some reason, although we hadn't been walking hard. "Spy stuff," I said, winking at her. Elena shook her head, her cheeks flushed scarlet. "I'm done. We're in Chernaya now, and you have no right to hold me. I'm taking the train the rest of the way home." She started walking toward the street. "Seriously, goodbye. she said over her shoulder when none of us immediately called after her. I felt a pang of fear for her. I found this strange because I didn't particularly like her all that much. Well, I reasoned to myself, you might not like your impertinent little sister. Still, you don't really want her to drown in a lake. As he watched her go, Eluane seemed far less concerned than he had been in New Babylon. Then he cast a sly eye back towards us. "Walaj," he said, "go with her. Agree with her about how terrible I am if you must. She'll mostly want to hear herself speak a while. But by all means, make sure she doesn't board until the final train to Sevgorod. The final train. You'll know it by the loud steam whistle. You can't miss it from anywhere. Maybe from a long life of taking orders, or maybe because he felt some unpaid debt. Walaj merely nodded and trotted off after her. "Chernaeans," Eluane said to me, as if that was all the explanation needed. "What do you make of this rune?" "It's a cross inside a circle," I said, and put my hand on my hips as I considered. "That means something very different in my world." "Oh, I see. This is like the wall painting in Nerythea. Just more crude." He nodded. "And there is a tick at a certain point along the wheel," I observed. "I don't understand. How are we to know if it refers to the cycle of a day, a month, a season, an aeon?" He put a finger to his lips and smiled. "Think on it. The morning, the first quarter of a life, and the spring are all related, but I agree. That doesn't help us much for determining the time of a covert meeting. Still, I already know today is the appointed day, so it refers to..." "Evening," I said. The tick was in the fourth quadrant. They were using a sacred symbol like the face of a crude clock, between 9 o'clock and midnight. And the time also sets the tone for the meaning of this gathering. Where will this meeting be if we can guess when? Sendirians are all trained in Oyun ways, but it takes a little faith in omens. "So what you're saying is, you don't know," I said wryly, struggling to keep up. Nisa wandered along behind us, humming to herself, oblivious to the conversation. "Not precisely." We came to a fork in the road, one path splitting off to run up and directly atop the other, a winding cobblestone road that wound its way down the upper lip of the rock precipice, where it was still at something of an incline. Eluane drew up his cloak so that his disguised face was obstructed from view, and he seemed even more wary of pedestrians, although there were few. I could hear the constant, far-off rumbling and clanking of the machines, and further down still, I could make out mining carts that groaned as they hauled ore from the upper levels of what had once been Nerythea. Eluane was muttering to himself, and I realized he was counting the number of houses aloud as we passed them. Finally, he stopped. 139. We are here, he proclaimed. But where was that? I wondered. The building we stood before was a squat brick front with 2 soot-stained windows, barely more than a facade upon the rock face. There was a door with a knocker, quite old and rarely used from what I could tell. Eluane peered through the windows, but even his keen eyes couldn't have made out much of what was beyond. However, it did appear that there was the flicker of firelight from somewhere within the recesses of the structure, which was carved into the solid stone. "Well?" I asked as he continued to crane his neck at the windows and stand awkwardly on what must have been someone's front doorstep. "Well, what?" he snapped back. "Well, what are we here for?" He nodded slowly as if he just remembered that others were present. This was once the home of some people who were very important to me, and very important to our cause. He sighed and then shrugged, resigning himself to follow through with what he came here to do. He lifted up the knocker and let it fall firmly 4 times. The loud crack of metal on wood echoed around us, but for some time there was no stirring from within. Then there was a shuffling sound, like sandals on stone, and several dry coughs. And then the door was yanked open, although only far enough for me to see the outline of a face and a coal-blackened hand. "Who's there?" a voice asked. "I am a friend of Bogdan and Inna. Do they still live here?" "Who is asking? Friend?" Their face was still not visible, but the eyes were rheumy, the voice ragged and slow. "I am a Sendirian." There was an uncomfortable pause. I wouldn't go around here saying that. "Are you going to report me?" Eluane asked. "It'd just be trouble for me. But I'll tell you this. They were taken off to the crater for being associated with the likes of you. That was years ago. And if you knew them so well, you'd know they were our parents. Now get out of here." "I'm sorry to hear that. But if they return, might you consider—" "You put false hope in their heads. We survived. No thanks to you. Our doors remain shut forever on Sendir. You should not have come here." The door slammed in Eluane's face. He lowered his head and turned around. When he spoke, it seemed to be to himself. They deserved better than a Chernaean early retirement. "I guess that mask only shields you from so much," I said dryly. He didn't respond and turned towards another alley. After about a dozen blocks, this alley opened to a broad street lined with stone markers. Now it was overrun with Chernaean workers' houses, a hardy breed of weed that had sprouted in identical rows of brick and concrete. But I could still see a graveyard in their midst, its borders set off with a rotting wooden fence. "Can't you call upon their spirits?" I asked him. "You mean Bogdan and Inna?" I nodded. "I have tried. One Chatilian is really not enough to find every lost soul." The building stopped, as if in reverence for the empty field that once stood on this spot, and the country road that once led there. I realized Eluane was navigating by way of this hidden architecture, moving through the geography of the past as readily as the one I saw before me. That road was gone, but it had left its imprint on the lay of the land. He stopped in front of the graveyard, now looking puzzled. A raven perched on one of the worn gravestones. Beneath it were the words, "We will never forget." But the rest was lost to weather, and a patina of moss, the shade of tarnished bronze. I couldn't stop staring at that gravestone. The inscription was only enough to remind one that something had been forgotten, which struck me as both funny and profoundly sad. The ragged bird spoke to him, though I couldn't make out the words. "Thank you," he replied to the spirit as it took to the air. He cut a wide path around the graveyard and down yet another side street, beads and bones rattling like a gourd with each step. There stood a church out of place on the horizon. As we made our way up the hill toward it, I saw it was long abandoned and nothing like the mold-poured concrete buildings around it. Once, it must have been awe-inspiring. In the pitted stone above the doors, a line of text was engraved. As if following my gaze, Eluane translated quietly, "What you are now, we once were. What we are now, you ever shall be." Roof panels swept out from beneath the central tower, fashioned of larch wood, curving upward like tousled feathers. The sickly daylight, gray-green, painted the central spire black, a beak pecking skyward. All in all, the church looked like an old raven itself. I told Eluane as much as we approached, and he chuckled. The Duvik are not without their sense of irony. They honored us in their way. I think it keeps them alive when all their gods have been so thoroughly slaughtered. How so? This used to be one of their churches built atop a yet more ancient burial ground. Before Chernaean soldiers came, the people who lived here worshipped the lords of the dead. He waved a hand as if he found it embarrassing and wished to shoo the thought away like one of his birds. That's what they used to call us, among other things. The meeting will be here, after sunset. I am quite certain of it. I was surprised the conquerors of this land would allow the church to remain. After all, the Duvik had once slaughtered the ancestral tribe of the Chernaeans. That distant, half-forgotten memory clearly provoked the savagery that was unleashed on that day, when they descended on this very hillside from their Wayland farmsteads and began setting houses alight, though few of them were aware they were compelled by the same pattern that Eluane had recognized in the lay of the graveyard, the symmetry of revenge. They were merely closing a circle with blood. As with the graveyard, the people who lived here thereafter retained some sense of deference to those who had been eradicated, as if the fine might rise someday from the mists, and the survivors' descendants could then say to them, "Do you see? We maintained your sacred ground long after you and your ancestors had been forgotten." And after all, not all the Duvik were slaughtered, just enough to send down the signal that it was time for the worship of new flags, and to forget about all their dead gods. For all gods are dead, but those yet remembered remain as powerful as they ever were. So too Duvik would later have their vengeance on Wayland in the border wars. As the years passed, the kingdoms and tribes that unified under the Chernaean flag forgot that the elder, primeval gods, they who have fallen out of all memory, grow more powerful still, for they dwell in our hearts as well as in the weave of the world, and one day they will return to reflect the savagery of their years in exile within the void. Inside, we found a group already gathered in what had once been the pews. Their sentries let out a hoot, and several rifles and nocked arrows were already trained on our throats as we crossed the threshold. Some of them dropped from the rafters on ropes, while others approached from the back. We regarded each other warily from across the hall. They were 5 or 6 from Duvik, who still kept to the old ways, and a handful of Karluchatil. According to Eluane, they were a mix of the children of former Sendirian agents, outcasts who refused to tithe the crown, and youths who retained a fascination for illegal witchcraft. I called to mind what else he told me, that the Karluchatil were the outcast survivors of those few Chatilians who had bred with humans for lack of milieu. With each passing generation, he had said somberly, there was less Feyan about them. I scowled at him and didn't speak to him for a while after that, as I recall, for his sense of disdain seemed ill-earned. And after all, what would he say if that child were his own? Indeed, they seemed to have little place in the Chernaean world, those who weren't turned to the mines or sold into servitude elsewhere. And the Tovag outright despised them as degenerates, so they eked out their existence at the borders, as trappers or traders. Though some still recalled the tales of their parents and lived through them still. Some even continued to practice as lesser Oyon, though few had been properly initiated. When they were within speaking distance of us, they lowered their weapons. Eluane raised his hands and then turned to look up at the failing light in the windows, set into the wall high above the entrance. "My name is Niril," one said. "I speak for us." Niril was one of several Karluchatil present, and was the most charming amongst this pack of coyotes. His face was blunt and handsome, his hair deep brown, almost black. He had a look I've seen in many that live on the road. It seems to seep into your pores, but after a time it erodes the spirit, like a stone worn smooth by rushing river water. His clothes were a patched motley, even more so than Eluane's tattered garments, for Niril's had never been sacred or crafted of fine skins and silks. A musket and scimitar hung at his side, and both seemed to have seen much use, a fact insinuated by his casual confidence as well as physical wear. Here was a scavenger, not a soldier. But scavengers survive, in part, by being chronically underestimated, so their hardness was no surprise to me, but that exterior seemed to crack when they learned who had called the order back into attendance. Some clasped their hands, others gasped, but Niril's eyes narrowed and his voice grew quiet, a whisper as sharp as a knife. "Well, we have come. Say your part." Eluane nodded slowly, and when it seemed he might speak, he only nodded again, this time even slower than the first. The others shifted and shuffled, some looking over their shoulders at windows and doors, perhaps wondering if they were betrayed and this charlatan was merely buying time. Then Niril crouched before him, and the others did likewise, sitting attentively as Eluane finally began to speak, for he had this theatrical way about him, despite his supposed great reticence to bring it out, with long stretches of moodiness between each performance. As some of you will recall, Skalliheim was originally built of ageless black stone, a mountain of rock with high, fortified walls and gatehouse. It long stood guard against attack from the original peoples that settled the north, when this wild land belonged entirely to the Fane, This tower at Skalliheim's center hails from the long-forgotten ages between the Sundering and the rise of Chernaya. Who can say how long? In those first days when Alteran was still wild, humankind would not venture north of the divide, for they would be lost in the summer tree's maze of roots and swirling sands or the mad mutations that occurred at the outer reaches. "One moment. Does anyone have a match?" Eluane asked, so suddenly that they blinked in confusion for what seemed like some time, until a match was finally proffered. He struck it and lit his pipe. "Thank you kindly." It wasn't until some point during Belgarian's early reign, possibly between skewering his first wife on a meat hook and feeding his daughters to his son's pet dogs, that this lone monolith was reclaimed and expanded for a favored baron, Baron the Bald. This baron took Skalliheim, and it became the furthest permanent encampment of Chernaean troops so far north. He swiftly thereafter seized Sevgorod from the mad bastard, and thence his crown. A strange form of repayment, wouldn't you say? From that day forward, new recruits were sent there to be trained as the elite of the new empire. One of the Duvicians grunted, others shifted. "Old history from an old man." "What does this have to do with us?" one of them said. "It concerns me, and it will soon concern you. Today the halls of the abandoned keep are said to be haunted. As the story goes, many years after the Second Rebellion, every Chernaean in the place was slaughtered at their post. The Tovag had come in force at last, down the mountains like an avalanche. Niril cut in this time. "You say you are Anarian Eluane, and certainly you wear his garb and know his stories. But for a generation it has been said that no more Cotillians walk in the north, or indeed anywhere at all. Where have you been when the sons and daughters of your people needed you? I am telling you where I have been, if you had any patience." Eluane coughed into his hand and paused, it seemed to me for effect, although it only served to agitate his audience more. The Tovag wreaked havoc throughout Skalliheim's torch-lit halls, severing the heads of guard and servant alike, their corpses staring blankly like the Tovag's own blind seers. They carried off the legs of the slain to later be carved into flutes for their ceremonies. That is when the Tovag came at last to my cell door, for I was held captive there, my punishment, it seems, for being both Shatillian and an agent of Sendir. So this is the answer to your question. What I've been doing with myself all these years. Are you satisfied? Eluane's eyes flickered in an uncomfortably predatory way in the dim light. "You weren't the only one punished," Niril said evenly. And what he meant but did not say was that his ancestors had once rallied behind the same cause. "How can I forget?" Eluane said, not undramatically, raising his arms over his head. Then he let them drop. "I often dreamed of escape from that cell. And while I sat there, the remaining Chatillians were extinguished, one at a time. I wished I could vanish into the hills that ring the empty halls of Nirithia like scar flesh round an old wound. If I could only hide there until the stars also forgot my name and fell, one at a time, from the raiment of the sky." I realized that Eluane was citing some old scripture. I doubted they had ever read it, and I certainly had not at the time. Niril rubbed his stubbled chin, not especially taken in by Eluane's poetry. "Fine. What you dream in a cell and what you do under the open sky are two different things. What of the years after your escape? I do not belong to you. I sequestered myself from the world, a faceless wanderer, but there were signs, and I found to my surprise that I couldn't ignore them. As if on cue, word reached me from a former agent in Rostova. His daughter was having prophetic dreams. Then the stars became agitated. "And what of those who travel with you and stand behind you in silence?" Niril asked. "Are they your servants?" "Your timing is good, for it is at this point that they enter my tale," Eluane said. He then recounted the horrors and wonders we had witnessed, which took the better part of an hour. He concluded, "We face a decision now. Vengeance will continue to be unleashed as she awakens in your dreams. Sleepwalkers with hatchets can do just as much damage as a trained hunter. This is a choice we can make together, or alone, but it will come to each of our doorsteps." They seemed to consider his words somberly, but a bearded Duvikian rapped his knuckles against a wooden beam and shook his head. Like many in attendance, he had the complexion of one of the hill people from Old Duvik, though he spoke more like a Chernayan. "And you want us to take this back to our people and rally in the aid of those who killed our parents? Tales of the Red Goddess driving us all mad? And what good would a handful of us do, even if what you say is true?" Another ventured, before Eluane could respond to the first. "Well, look around you, Prince," the first said, his eyes narrowing. "We are no underground army of shadows. I sell fish for a living." "There aren't many of us left, is there?" Another cut in. "The best agents are all long in the ground. We have already lost this war." Sounds of general assent went up around the room. "Then why did you come?" Eluane asked, and they had no reply. They merely shifted, the pews creaking beneath them like the boards of an old ship. I found myself unable to remain silent. I stood tall, and my voice rang out in the ancient hall. "I am a stranger to this world, but maybe that gives me a clearer perspective. Let me ask you, if the goddess of New Babylon is awakening people like the Mibari, people who have lived in mud all their lives, while their brothers sat in palaces reading the future in the stars, why should we side against her?" I took his hand, and I'm sure my eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. Her children sought to enslave me, and yet I still don't see the sense in this. Help this empire, you say, spreads across the land like a cloud of locusts, eating, turning everything into little Chernaya. No. Why do we not join her and slit their throats while they sleep? Eluane pulled away from me and looked to the others, but they seemed to grant my point with their averted gazes. "You still do not understand. She does not belong in this world." "Maybe this world deserves to end," I replied, thinking of the scourge that had marched ever eastward. They wore different uniforms when they wore uniforms at all. It couldn't be opposed from within. Those who didn't obey were themselves shot. There was no option but resistance, no outcome but death. "Aita," he said very gently, "think of what you saw in Ashanti. Is that the birth of something better, or a hand reaching up to strangle its own throat? Through all who sleepwalk in the second world, she does her work. Did you hear nothing that was said in the tent with Sama? Have you forgotten all you have seen here? Her awakening is already at hand." I nodded, conceding there was some truth in what he said of the horrors I'd seen in the desert. His voice grew softer still. Her soul has been tortured and corrupted, festering in 1,000 cycles of human nightmares. Now that concentrated poison slides back into every rickety bed across the empire. I shook my head, exasperated. Niril held out his hand, apparently considering this conversation at an end. If anything, I seemed to have served Eluane's purpose. For now, Niril was eager to get to the point. "Eluane, you are demanding we live up to the oaths taken by dead parents and grandparents. Very well. So, if we vote in agreement, what would you have us do? You will shore up our old networks and make contact with those in leadership that might be sympathetic, recruit, train, grow. We, for our part, must venture to the House of Bones and hear One Eye's augury. Then, maybe, I will be better informed in my next decisions. I will attempt to gain the aid of the Tovag." Niril laughed. "You give yourself the hardest task." Eluane nodded gravely, glancing at us in concern, though at that point I did not know why. "But a potentially valuable ally." Niril eyed him skeptically and then looked back to the others. They hesitated, and then seemed to all rise as one. "Very well," he said again, his arms held wide. "It is time. Let's take a measure of it." In the end, to my surprise, their vote was 6-4 to 5 against. The old myths of the Fine still seemed to hold some sway here, so it was determined. We would go our separate ways as agents of the Order, using what was remembered of fine lore to keep the Red Goddess in her coffin where they believed she belonged. I realize now that I started to look at Eluane differently then, and I may have fought it, but the effect was inevitable. Plunk! The stone finally landed at the bottom of a very deep well. Once a stone lands, you can't stop the ripples from spreading. He had become more Shernaian than he realized. Or perhaps he'd known what he was doing in helping Arin long before. I saw how these men grumbled and complained, but were at the same time compliant as lambs to the slaughter. After the meeting, we idled toward the train station like a group of tourists, with the intention of meeting Wallage and Elena there at the sounding of the final whistle. All seemed quieter than it should be, and people hurried down side streets, vanishing into their homes or stores, or huddled in dark cellarways. Vultures hung in the hazy air above the city of Highmount, and Eluane seemed to take them as a harbinger of the fate that would surely soon envelop all of the Second World. He shook his head. "That is strange," he said to me, shielding his eyes and squinting. "They don't normally venture this far north from the foothills of Duralia." Eluane pulled out a spyglass and, turning to the south, peered through it. From my vantage point, I could only see that something moved in the desert, and it moved in the sky as well, a formless mass dark against the light sand. You could feel it in the air first. A stillness, as a pall seemed to fall upon the sun itself. The skies blackened with its approach. Rifles bristled on the soot-blackened parapets of the city. Great guns with barrels wide as a man were wheeled into position along the walls. For they still imagined they would fight a conventional foe, an army gathered, trained, paid, and marched from the south. But this army was fueled by a malignancy incubated in 1,000 years of dreams. 1,000 years, and then, overnight, as if heeding the call of a chorus of trumpets at dawn, a change overcame the people that lived in New Babylon. In the maze of their city, they forgot their names, their families, and any concern of their prior lives. A horror long nursed out of sight suddenly burst forth. Shedding their skins and the illusion of humanity along with them, they rose like a swarm of locusts that eclipsed the sun. "Hurry!" Eluane shouted. He slammed the spyglass shut in his palm and rushed down a steep alley. We made our way together toward a road that shadowed the main thoroughfare, shrouded on both sides by rows of fir trees. "Come on then," he called to us as we struggled to keep pace, peering at the commotion we could spy between the branches. We heard the clanging of a bell and alarms roaring further off, sounding thin and hollow in the chill autumn air. "What about Wallage and Elena?" I asked as we ran. "The station!" he yelled without any further explanation. The ringing grew even more shrill as we shoved through an aggregation of confused bodies, all running in different directions, their faces registering shock and terror. A steel track now followed the road, and we saw steam huffing from atop one of the famed Chernayan passenger trains, which sat impatiently, half-shrouded in mist. Its loud whistle joined the din blasting through the city. If Wallage still has ears, he will hear that, I thought. We pushed our way through the flock, their faces smeared like sooty ghosts. Chernayan soldiers stood along the track, stern in their red, white, and gold imperial garb. A fat official was in their midst, inspecting tickets through his monocle, his mustache quivering as he spoke. I could see the soldiers were holding back the throng, and only allowing through those who seemed to be the best dressed among them. And to my relief, there stood Wallage, with Elena at his side, peeking over the throng on tiptoes. Her eyes lit up when she saw us, her near tantrum earlier apparently forgotten. "Eta, Eluane, over here!" she called, waving her arms at us. "Everyone must wait their turn," the official shouted as we pushed to meet one another. Elena stepped toward him boldly. "I am Elena Kurlstar, the eldest daughter of the Minister of Science." "Is that right now, little lady?" he said. Then he fixed his stare on her more closely. "Your parents allow you to go around looking like that? Sullied and torn clothes, hair a tangle?" Elena's eyes narrowed with rage, but she said matter-of-factly, "We've been camping in the fen." What is your name and rank, sir? A soldier at the official's side laid a hand on his bolt-action rifle. Like all Chernayan soldiers, he had a closely cropped beard, and like many, a casual indifference in his voice that may as well have been cruelty. He said, "There's no time for this. If any child can pretend to be the daughter of a noble—" The official shrugged, but otherwise appeared to ignore him. "So you say. Who are these foreigners with you, then?" "My servants," Elena said, gesturing towards us dismissively. "Get back, or it will be the last thing you do," the soldier said to her, just as matter-of-factly. Elena opened her mouth in mute shock, but the official shook his head, perhaps not wanting any trouble later, or perhaps only offended at the challenge to his authority. He cleared his throat and peered through the smoke with a squint, giving him a troubled air. "No, no, we can't be turning good Rostovans away. Let them on, I say." A man in the crowd tried to shove past Elena at what turned out to be the worst possible time for him. The soldier grabbed him roughly and slammed him against the side of the train car. As I stepped aboard, I heard the dull thwack of the soldier's rifle butt pulping the man's skull until his frustration was spent. This seemed to distract him, and we slipped on without another complaint. The inside of the cabin was lined with benches adorned in red and purple velvets, embroidered in faux gold, and long curtains affixed to oval windows. The floor was carpeted with a repeating pattern of the imperial crown. All of it was worn from decades of use, clearly maintained but never replaced. However, it must have once been truly regal. Now the train was crowded beyond normal capacity, and the 5 of us had to pack onto a single bench. "Servants?" Eluane whispered to Elena, grinning from under the bearded mask that hid his true face. "It worked, didn't it?" she said defensively. "You did well," he said, and the 2 of us smiled at one another, amused that the single gambit she seemed to know had finally worked. The train lurched and then began rattling along the tracks. We heard a low hum from the direction of the city and a fierce and nauseatingly familiar buzzing like a nest of angry hornets. Through the windows, I could make out iron tanks rolling toward the commotion and the darkness that seemed to follow us inexorably from the south, even as the roar of the falls at Nivek and the boom of cannon and crackle of rifle fire receded into the distance.
That's all for this week's episode. Stay up to date with upcoming episodes by subscribing at fallencycle.podbean.com or wherever you prefer to listen to your podcasts. Check out the work of the contributing musicians. Those links and additional information is available in the text provided along with this episode. This audio edition was produced by James Kershaw, along with text-to-speech synthesis. A statement on the use of LLMs is available on our website for those curious about how we do and don't use these technologies. This podcast is Creative Commons 3.0, attribution, share and share alike, non-commercial use.